The courtroom was alive with tension the moment Jasmine Crockett walked to the podium. Cameras clicked, papers shuffled, and reporters leaned forward, anticipating something more than a routine legal hearing. The topic on the table was digital monitoring in workplaces, a subject that had quietly affected millions, but rarely received the attention it deserved. Employees had been complaining about constant surveillance, from keystrokes to app usage, and now a group had asked the court to define boundaries for what was acceptable. Across from Jasmine, Justice Alito presided with his usual composed seriousness, his eyes sharp, his posture firm. He had a reputation for cutting through arguments quickly and holding speakers to the strictest legal standards, which meant anyone who tried to mix emotional stories with legal claims risked being dismissed. Jasmine, however, had prepared thoroughly. She knew she would need to balance the human impact of monitoring with the legal principles that guided the courtroom. As she adjusted the microphone, she looked out at the audience. Employees, lawyers, students, journalists, saw waiting too. See if one voice could make a difference in an environment dominated by rules and formalities. She began with a calm introduction, laying out the basics of what digital monitoring in the workplace entailed. She spoke about automated tracking software, key logging, and location tracking, explaining in simple language what each system did and why it mattered to workers. Some in the audience nodded knowingly, recalling moments when they themselves felt watched, when they knew that every click, pause, or delay could be logged, interpreted, and judged. She didn't stop at the technical explanation. Jasmine connected it to the human experience. Employees who felt anxious because they couldn't take breaks freely, who worried that even minor mistakes could be tracked and misrepresented, who felt their privacy was being compromised without a clear understanding or meaningful consent. She told short, factual stories from the workers she represented. One employee had stopped taking lunch breaks, fearing it would appear as slacking. Another had avoided reporting minor mistakes, knowing that any error could be flagged in the system. Jasmine highlighted how these behaviors weren't laziness or incompetence. They were responses to an environment where surveillance had created fear. At that moment, the tension in the room thickened. Justice Alito leaned slightly forward, frowning but listening. He interrupted, as expected, telling Jasmine to stick to legal arguments rather than personal stories. The interjection could have derailed anyone. Any would have faltered, retraced their steps, or hastily attempted to strip emotion from the narrative. But Jasmine didn't hesitate. She paused deliberately, letting the silence settle just long enough for everyone to notice the weight of the moment. Then she responded clearly, respectfully, and firmly, explaining that human experience was inseparable from law. Policies and rules only worked when applied to real people, and ignoring the emotional and psychological impact of surveillance could lead to unintended consequences that the law needed to anticipate. The courtroom was quiet, hanging on her words. Even Justice Alito's expression softened slightly. The firmness still there, but his eyes showing that he was considering her point. Jasmine didn't stop at abstract statements. She tied her stories to specific legal principles. The idea of reasonable expectations of privacy, the duty of employers to balance efficiency with fairness, and the responsibility of courts to protect individuals from practices that could cause harm or fear. She explained that surveillance tools weren't inherently bad, but unchecked or poorly defined systems could undermine the very productivity companies sought to protect. She emphasized that employees wanted clear boundaries, transparency, and respect, not to avoid accountability, but to work confidently without feeling constantly monitored. The audience reacted subtly but noticeably. Employees in the room shifted in their chairs, recognizing their own experiences in Jasmine's words. Students scribbled notes, realizing that the topic wasn't just abstract legal theory, but connected to everyday work life they might enter soon. Reporters exchanged glances, sensing a story that was not only factual but human. The energy changed again when Jasmine highlighted a specific case example. showing how a tracking system had flagged a minor delay as a productivity concern, leading to unnecessary internal warnings. She pointed out that the language in employee agreements was often vague, full of legal jargon, and not easily understood by the people who signed them. Her explanation was precise, yet accessible, bridging the gap between legal theory and practical impact. Justice Alito's interjections became less frequent as he listened, occasionally jotting notes. He still maintained a serious demeanor, but it was clear he could not dismiss the human evidence Jasmine was presenting. She had anticipated this moment and had carefully prepared references to laws and precedents that supported her points, ensuring that her stories were anchored in the legal framework, not just emotion. The audience could feel the balance Jasmine struck. She wasn't pleading. She was demonstrating, illustrating the intersection between policy and personal impact. She made clear that the case wasn't about punishing companies or halting. Product was about ensuring fairness and clarity, protecting employees while respecting legitimate business needs. When Jasmine concluded her initial statements, she didn't raise her voice or demand immediate judgment. Instead, she summarized her argument succinctly: that the law must consider human behavior, that policies without clear boundaries could unintentionally harm workers, and that courts had the responsibility to define reasonable limits. The room felt the weight of her words. Employees nodded in quiet agreement. Journalists prepared to capture the statements for wider dissemination. Students and interns whispered softly, marveling at how one speaker could command attention without theatrics. Justice Alito paused, adjusting his robe, and then asked a pointed question about specific legal precedent, signaling that the conversation was moving to the formal debate phase. Jasmine met his gaze calmly, ready with precise references and explanations, knowing that this was the moment she had prepared for, combining human experience with legal argumentation, showing that the two were inseparable when it came to protecting rights in modern workplaces. The room remained charged, every eye on her, every mind considering the intersection of technology, law, and personal experience. The opening statements were over, but the tension and curiosity only deepened. People were left wondering, could Jasmine bridge the gap between strict legal reasoning and the lived reality of employees? And would Justice Alito respond openly to her arguments, or attempt to shut down the personal examples that made her points resonate so strongly? The air was thick with anticipation, setting the stage for a courtroom debate that promised to be more than procedural. Promised to be memorable, human, and thought-provoking. And in that moment, everyone understood that the hearing had already shifted from a simple legal examination to a compelling dialogue about fairness, privacy, and the human impact of technology in modern workplaces. With Jasmine Crockett leading the charge, the courtroom remained tense as Jasmine Crockett shifted from her opening statements to deeper arguments, knowing that this was the stage where the conversation would get real. Justice Alito had already made it clear that he wanted the debate anchored in law, not emotion. Yet Jasmine understood that ignoring the human stories would weaken the argument. She began by acknowledging the company's perspective, showing that she wasn't there to demonize anyone. She explained that businesses faced pressures to stay competitive, meet deadlines, and manage large teams efficiently. She highlighted that digital monitoring tools were often implemented to track performance, identify issues early, and ensure that projects didn't fall behind. The audience could see that she understood the practical concerns. Nods spread quietly through the courtroom, showing that both employees and business representatives recognized her fairness. Then she pivoted to the employee's viewpoint, illustrating the subtle, sometimes invisible ways monitoring affected their daily lives. She described workers who constantly felt observed, who avoided taking short breaks for fear of being flagged as inefficient, and who developed stress because every click or idle moment could be recorded and evaluated. She didn't exaggerate her examples were carefully chosen, relatable, and grounded in real experiences. Jasmine emphasized that these pressures didn't just impact work performance, They affected mental health, creativity, and overall job satisfaction. People in the courtroom leaned in, some frowning in recognition, some whispering to themselves, realizing they or someone they knew had felt similar pressure. Justice Alito raised his eyebrows, listening, but still interjected with a procedural comment reminding Jasmine to reference legal precedent. She didn't react defensively. Instead, she acknowledged the point and smoothly transitioned her stories into legal reasoning. She connected the employees' experiences with established legal concepts. Reasonable expectations of privacy, limits on employer oversight, and the court's responsibility to ensure that business practices didn't unintentionally violate personal rights. By doing so, she reinforced that her argument wasn't about emotion versus law. It was about the law applying meaningfully to real-life situations. The courtroom energy shifted subtly. Employees in the audience began exchanging glances, as if finally hearing their concerns articulated in a way that mattered in a legal context. Students and young lawyers scribbled notes, learning a live lesson in blending human experience with legal frameworks. Even members of the business community nodded, recognizing that fair boundaries could prevent misunderstanding and potential legal challenges. Jasmine didn't stop there. She addressed a specific clause in the digital monitoring policy used by one company, pointing out its vagueness. Terms like relevant activity and trusted third parties were meant to cover many scenarios, she said, but their ambiguity created uncertainty for employees. They didn't always know what was being collected, why it was collected, or how it might be used. By tying ambiguity to concrete consequences, Jasmine made the abstract concrete. She showed how unclear language and policies could inadvertently erode trust and even reduce productivity because employees worked cautiously rather than confidently. Justice Alito leaned back slightly, listening, though his expression remained neutral. Jasmine recognized that she had to remain composed. Her words had to be precise and grounded, showing that she was advocating for practical solutions, not personal grievances. She offered potential pathways forward, proposing that monitoring systems be transparent with clear boundaries, and coupled with open communication to employees about what data was collected and why. She emphasized that efficiency and fairness were not mutually exclusive. A company could track performance while respecting employees' dignity, provided that policies were clear, accessible, and considerate of human behavior. A few murmurs of agreement passed through the audience, subtle but noticeable. Jasmine noticed a few young employees whispering to each other, nodding, realizing that their own discomfort wasn't imagined. It was validated by someone who had taken the time to understand and articulate it. Justice Alito interjected again, asking a pointed question about precedent and whether courts had previously balanced business needs against employee privacy. Jasmine answered with poise, citing cases where the courts recognized that workers had reasonable expectations of privacy even within monitored environments. She explained that these decisions weren't about restricting companies unnecessarily, but about setting boundaries that prevented overreach. Her tone was respectful but firm, demonstrating that she could navigate legal reasoning while maintaining a focus on human impact. The dialogue became more dynamic as Alito continued questioning. He asked hypothetical scenarios, challenging her to explain how employees could be protected without impeding legitimate business operations. Jasmine responded by acknowledging the tension inherent in balancing these interests. She argued that proper implementation of monitoring systems, regular communication, and education about how data was used could address both concerns. Employees could feel safe, and companies could achieve accountability. The courtroom felt the weight of her reasoning. She wasn't demanding one side be silenced. She was offering a nuanced solution that addressed the needs of both. At one point, Jasmine paused to let the audience absorb her argument. The courtroom was silent, attentive, every eye on her. Then she told a brief, factual story about an employee whose minor mistake was misinterpreted due to automated tracking, leading to unnecessary internal warnings. She used it not to incite outrage, but to illustrate the real consequences of policies applied without clarity. That story made the abstract risks tangible. And even members of the business community nodded, recognizing the potential pitfalls. Jasmine then emphasized that her aim was not to oppose technology or efficiency. She acknowledged that tracking tools could be beneficial if applied thoughtfully and transparently. She pointed out that employees weren't against monitoring in principle. They wanted to know the rules and feel they could trust the system. By framing the argument this way, Jasmine strengthened her position. She was advocating for accountability, clarity, and fairness, not restriction or obstruction. Justice Alito appeared to consider her words carefully. He asked a final set of clarifying questions about specific legal standards for workplace privacy, and the limits of employer authority. Jasmine answered methodically, showing how courts could interpret policies in ways that respected both employees and companies. Her responses were clear, precise, and legally sound, leaving little room for misinterpretation. By the time this part of the hearing concluded, the audience had shifted from passive observers to engaged participants. Employees felt seen, business representatives felt understood. And the broader implications for workplace policy and technology became clearer to everyone present. Jasmine had successfully navigated the delicate balance of advocating for workers while acknowledging legitimate business interests. The courtroom left the session with a renewed sense that solutions were possible when human experience and legal reasoning intersected thoughtfully. As the session adjourned for a brief break, whispers of recognition and reflection filled the room. Reporters exchanged notes, students shared observations, and employees nodded quietly, realizing their stories mattered. Jasmine collected her papers calmly, knowing she had laid the foundation for the next phase of the debate, where she would need to confront further legal challenges, anticipate counter-arguments, and continue bridging the gap between law and human experience. The tension lingered, but now it was charged with anticipation rather than frustration. Part 2 had shown that understanding both sides was not only possible, but necessary. And everyone in the room sensed that Jasmine's next moves could shape the course of the discussion, potentially setting new standards for how digital monitoring and employee rights were considered in the modern workplace. The courtroom felt charged when Part 3 of the hearing began, the kind of energy that made everyone lean forward instinctively, waiting to see if the conversation would break open or stall under legal formalities. Jasmine Crockett, standing confidently at the podium, had already established that her argument was grounded in both human experience and legal principles. Now she needed to move beyond examples and show the court how balance between employer needs and employee rights could actually be achieved. Justice Alito had been attentive, occasionally frowning, occasionally jotting notes. And his interruptions were sharper now, testing the strength of her arguments. He asked pointed questions about whether any limits she proposed would hinder legitimate business practices, suggesting that if her recommendations were too strict, companies could suffer financially, potentially affecting jobs. Jasmine nodded, acknowledging the concern. She began by explaining that the goal was not to restrict companies arbitrarily, but to create clarity and predictability in how monitoring systems were used. She argued that when employees understood what was being tracked and why, both sides benefited. The audience sensed a subtle shift. The debate was no longer about conflict, but about finding solutions that respected both efficiency and human dignity. Jasmine gave a concrete example, describing a mid-sized company that had implemented a clear, transparent system for monitoring project progress. Employees were informed in writing about what data was collected, how it would be used, and who had access. This policy reduced anxiety and errors, as employees felt trusted rather than scrutinized, while managers still had the oversight they needed. The courtroom reacted quietly but noticeably. Employees nodded in recognition, some whispering softly about similar experiences. Business representatives leaned back, considering the practicality of clear communication rather than just legal rules. Jasmine then addressed a common counterargument head-on. Many companies claimed that digital monitoring was necessary because employees would otherwise slack off, ignore responsibilities, or make mistakes. Jasmine explained that research showed trust and transparency led to better engagement and higher productivity than fear or excessive surveillance. When employees understood boundaries and expectations, they were more motivated, more creative, and less likely to experience burnout. Justice Alito interjected again, testing her reasoning. If employees ignored policies despite transparency, who bore responsibility? Jasmine responded thoughtfully, saying that no system was perfect, but clarity shifted accountability to both sides. Companies could implement tools fairly and responsibly, and employees could work confidently, knowing what was reasonable. She tied this back to legal precedent, citing cases where courts had recognized the importance of balancing operational needs with individual rights, showing that her proposals were grounded in law, not idealism. Then Jasmine introduced another layer, the human cost of unclear monitoring. She described employees who avoided asking questions, delayed reporting issues, or stayed silent during errors because they feared automated tracking would misinterpret their behavior. These small decisions created larger risks for companies, demonstrating that poorly communicated systems could actually undermine efficiency, not enhance it. By flipping the argument, Jasmine made it clear that fair monitoring wasn't just ethically, was practical. The courtroom seemed to lean in, and even Justice Alito's pen paused over his notes, the intensity of attention evident. Jasmine continued, highlighting how policies often used vague legal language to avoid liability. But that vagueness caused real confusion. Employees didn't need legal jargon, they needed clarity about expectations, boundaries, and consequences. She proposed simple solutions, written explanations in plain language, open channels for questions, and periodic reviews to ensure policies kept pace with technological change. She emphasized that these were practical steps, not radical reforms. To reinforce her point, Jasmine presented a short story about an employee whose minor technical mistake was flagged as a violation due to automated tracking. The employee had tried to explain the context but was dismissed, creating anxiety that lingered for months. The company, unaware of the emotional impact, assumed the system was working fine. Jasmine showed that small adjustments clarifying procedures, adding human oversight could prevent misunderstandings, protect workers' mental health, and preserve company efficiency. Her explanation was concise but layered, connecting policy, human behavior, and legal responsibility in a way that was easy for the audience to follow. Justice Alito leaned back, studying her, clearly weighing the practical implications. Jasmine seized the moment to further clarify her argument. She explained that efficiency should not come at the cost of dignity. Monitoring systems, when implemented without clear communication, eroded trust and led to hidden costs, disengaged employees, higher turnover, and unintended legal exposure. By approaching the issue from both sides' employer needs and employee well-being, she framed a solution that was balanced and actionable. The audience reacted subtly but perceptibly. Employees felt seen, business representatives recognized the logic, and students in the back scribbled notes about the nuanced way Jasmine had combined human experience with law. Jasmine concluded Part 3 by circling back to her key point. This was not a fight between productivity and fairness. It was about designing systems that respected boundaries, informed employees, and allowed companies to thrive without creating a culture of fear. She emphasized that courts had a responsibility to ensure that legal frameworks supported these goals, reinforcing that practical, thoughtful oversight benefited everyone. As she stepped back slightly from the podium, the courtroom seemed to breathe. The energy had shifted from confrontation to reflection. Justice Alito, still serious, seemed to be reconsidering earlier assumptions. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, capturing the balance Jasmine had struck. Employees whispered quietly, feeling validated. Business representatives whispered among themselves, recognizing that clarity could improve compliance and morale. Students and young lawyers watched intently, absorbing lessons about advocacy, communication, and the interplay between law and real life. The session ended without dramatic applause or overt celebration. There was no winner or loser announced, but the atmosphere was charged with a sense of progress. Jasmine had not only defended her arguments but had reframed the debate, showing that legal standards and human experience could coexist in a productive, thoughtful dialogue. As the courtroom broke for a short recess, the murmurs and quiet conversations reflected a shared understanding. Real solutions required listening, reasoning, and balance. Jasmine gathered her notes calmly, fully aware that Part 4 would bring even more challenging questions, but confident that she had built a strong foundation. She had demonstrated that thoughtful advocacy could reshape perceptions, even in the most formal and high-stakes settings. By the end of Part 3, everyone in the room, employees, employers, judges, and observers recognized that the discussion was no longer theoretical. It had become personal, practical, and profound, setting the stage for the final phase of the debate where the consequences, compromises, and clarity would be addressed in a way that could influence workplace policy far beyond that courtroom. When Part 4 began, the courtroom felt electric, a mix of anticipation and focus. Jasmine Crockett stood calmly at the podium, knowing that this was the moment to tie everything together, to transform the debate into a conversation that could lead to meaningful change. Justice Alito, attentive yet still stern, had been questioning the details of policies, legal precedent, and practical outcomes throughout the earlier parts of the hearing. Now the discussion was moving toward resolutions and real-world implications. Jasmine began by reiterating the balance she had emphasized in her prior arguments. Monitoring tools were not inherently wrong, and efficiency was important, but clarity, transparency, and respect for human dignity were equally essential. She described how ambiguity in monitoring policies caused employees to hesitate, second-guess their decisions, and avoid responsibilities not because they were careless but because fear had replaced trust. She linked this back to legal precedent, showing that courts had repeatedly recognized the importance of protecting workers' reasonable expectations of privacy while also acknowledging legitimate business needs. Jasmine then shifted to propose practical solutions, framing them as pathways rather than restrictions. She suggested companies create clear documentation for employees, explaining what data would be collected, why it mattered, and how it would be used. Periodic reviews could ensure that policies stayed current with changing technology, while open communication channels would allow employees to raise questions and clarify concerns. By framing solutions as constructive rather than adversarial, Jasmine encouraged collaboration rather than conflict. The courtroom listened intently. Employees leaned forward, nodding quietly, recognizing the policies she described as ones that would have directly improved their own experiences. Business representatives murmured among themselves, considering how proactive communication and transparency could actually prevent mistakes, reduce anxiety, and even improve productivity. Justice Alito interjected with a pointed question. How could these measures be enforced without imposing undue burdens on companies? Jasmine responded methodically, showing that the measures weren't meant to create extra work, but to ensure consistency, predictability, and fairness. She explained that clear boundaries could actually streamline processes, prevent misunderstandings, and reduce the risk of disputes, making both the employees' and employers' lives easier. The audience sensed that she had shifted from advocacy to problem-solving, presenting a roadmap rather than just an argument. She then shared a brief example, an employee who had been flagged for minor delays due to automated tracking. Because the company had vague policies, the incident led to unnecessary stress and mistakes. After clarifying procedures and providing transparent guidance, the same employee thrived, meeting deadlines and contributing creatively without fear. The contrast made a tangible point. Fairness and efficiency could coexist if policies were thoughtfully designed. Justice Alito appeared thoughtful, his usual stern demeanor softening slightly as he considered the practical implications. Jasmine seized this moment to emphasize the broader lesson that legal principles are most effective when applied with understanding of human behavior. Law alone cannot resolve all conflicts. It must guide and protect while respecting the lived experience of those affected. The courtroom seemed to absorb this, the tension easing into reflection. Jasmine didn't stop at corporate policy. She spoke about culture and mindset, highlighting that when employees feel valued and trusted, they are more engaged, productive, and innovative. Monitoring systems, when transparent and fair, can support performance without undermining morale. The key was balance, and she had illustrated how it could be achieved. Reporters in the gallery scribbled furiously, capturing quotes that were factual, accessible, and compelling. Students and young lawyers whispered excitedly about the clarity of her argument, realizing that advocacy could be both persuasive and respectful. Employees in the room murmured softly, feeling validated and understood. Business representatives, too, seemed to recognize the practical wisdom in her proposals. Jasmine then addressed potential objections. What if employees ignored policies or misused privileges? She acknowledged that no system is perfect, but proper training, communication, and monitoring oversight could minimize errors while preserving trust. She emphasized that fear-based compliance leads to mistakes, disengagement, and higher turnover, while clarity and collaboration foster accountability and loyalty. The audience reacted subtly but noticeably. Even Justice Alito, who had tried to maintain strict formality throughout, leaned forward slightly, indicating engagement rather than dismissal. Jasmine concluded her argument by framing the issue in terms everyone could relate to: that technology and monitoring are tools, not ends. How these tools are implemented shapes the experience of the workforce, the effectiveness of the organization, and the fairness of outcomes. By focusing on transparency, communication, and respect, companies could achieve efficiency without sacrificing dignity. When she finished, the courtroom remained silent for a moment. No applause, no dramatic gestures, just a collective pause as everyone absorbed the weight of her reasoning. Then, slowly, the energy shifted. Employees approached her quietly, thanking her for articulating what they had felt but could not express. Even a representative from one of the companies approached, acknowledging that her arguments had illuminated perspectives previously overlooked. Justice Alito, still seated, observed the interactions with a steady gaze, his posture firm but respectful. He asked clarifying questions about implementation, not to challenge but to understand, signaling that the conversation had moved beyond confrontation toward exploration. Jasmine answered each question with calm precision, connecting legal principles to practical solutions without diminishing the concerns of either side. As the session drew to a close, the atmosphere had transformed. What began as a high-tension debate between strict legal standards and employee experience evolved into a discussion about collaboration, fairness, and actionable change. Reporters and audience members left the room talking quietly among themselves, reflecting on what they had witnessed, a debate that didn't rely on shouting or emotional appeals, but on clarity, reasoning, and a balance of interests. Jasmine gathered her papers, smiling softly, but not triumphantly, aware that the work of translating advocacy into real-world change would continue. Outside the courtroom, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the steps, signaling the end of the session, but also the start of broader conversations about technology, privacy, and fairness in the workplace. The story of this hearing would circulate widely not as a dramatic battle of egos, but as an example of reasoned discourse, thoughtful advocacy, and the power of combining human experience with legal understanding. Jasmine's calm, clear, and balanced approach had reminded everyone present that change doesn't come from domination or silencing others. It comes from listening, reasoning, and proposing solutions that respect both law and humanity. The employees left with a sense of validation, the companies with practical ideas, and the broader audience with a lesson. Progress is possible when strong voices engage thoughtfully, and even the most formal settings can be transformed when arguments are grounded in fairness, clarity, and respect for human dignity. By the end of Part 4, the courtroom had witnessed more than a debate, had witnessed the potential for collaboration in a world where technology, Law and human experience intersect in complex but solvable ways. Jasmine Crockett had demonstrated that steadfast preparation, respectful engagement, and intelligent advocacy could not only withstand challenges but also reshape the conversation entirely, leaving an impression that would resonate far beyond the walls of the courtroom.